Barnes, head of terrorism research at George Washington University's program on extremism, here to continue explaining the history and evolution of the Hamas terror organization, both here and abroad. With us on this journey is senior research fellow Jennifer Baker.
So everyone, when we ended the last episode with the story of survival in a Hamas suicide attack on a bus in Jerusalem.
Yes, we did.
We also spoke about the arrest of the leaders of Infocom, the Elashi brothers, and said that Infocom was a company located across the street from HLF, where the FBI found hundreds of hidden HLF documents during a search warrant in 2001.
That's right. And I'm not sure if we pointed this out, but going back to the seized document that identified, that US-based Hamas infrastructure and its leaders as early as 1991, Bosman Elashi, one of the Infocom leaders, he's the brother of Ghassan Elashi, was number 18 on that original leadership list. So he was a part of this infrastructure from the very beginning as well.
And he was one of the officers of Infocom that was arrested.
Yes. And remember, they were arrested for a number of different charges.
Yes, I recall that.
And we discussed that CARE was opposed to this arrest, but I don't think we looked at the press release they issued.
Let's take a look at that.
On December 19, 2002, CARE's press release on the CARE DFW website was published and endorsed by CARE and the MLFA.
And we said the MLFA was created right after HLF was designated, right?
Yes.
Okay, and its registered agent was the HLF accountant.
That's right. And the statement by CARE here condemned the arrest and stated that we hope that their civil liberties, including their right to due process, is preserved, and that they were concerned that the charges were a result of, quote, a war on Islam and Muslims, rather than a war on terror. Well, the trial court split the charges into two separate categories. One category dealt with illegal shipments and the related conduct, and the other category dealt with unlawfully dealing in the funds of a specially designated terrorist. And two separate trials were held against Infocom and its officers.
And when was the first trial?
Well, the first trial was in 2003, and it related to the illegal shipments. And here is one of the prosecutors of the Infocom to talk to us about what they were charged with.
I'm Barry Jonas. I am an assistant U.S. attorney, but I am speaking here on my own behalf. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Justice or the U.S. government. Any opinions I give are my own. I was one of the Infocom prosecutors back in 2003, 2004, when I was with the counterterrorism section of the National Security Division. Infocom was an exporter of computer hardware to Middle Eastern countries. Over time, the company morphed into an internet service provider. And Infocom was charged with two different sets of charges, which all stem back to a law called, we call IEPA, International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Infocom, when they were an exporter of hardware, shipped to, among other places, Libya and Syria. And because those countries at the time were designated as state sponsors of terrorism, that was illegal. You could not do that unless you had a license from the U.S. government, and Infocom did not have that license. And so we charged them with multiple counts. Initially, there was an indictment back in early 2002. We charged a couple of defendants, and the defendants are the 5 Elashi brothers who were involved in the shipment of the computers to Libya and Syria. Regarding the first set of charges, the shipments to Libya and Syria, the shipments went to Libya through two means. There were two different customers in Libya. There was a customer called CIT that was owned by a Libyan who received shipments through Malta. And Malta, if you don't know, is a small country. It's now in the European Union. It's basically 3 tiny islands in the middle of the Mediterranean, somewhere between Sicily and Libya. And it's a well-known transshipment point, meaning a lot of stuff is sent to Malta, which then Maltese companies forward on to other countries. And we knew that Infocom, through documents that we had, we knew that they were shipping to Libya, but we couldn't necessarily prove that the shipments themselves went to Libya. In other words, we had information that we can use in court that the recipient, CIT, was based in Libya, but in terms of the paperwork that we had, it just showed the shipments going to and ending in Malta. So we went to Malta and we did these Rule 15 depositions with defense counsel, and we had to hire we had to use the local prosecutor under their rules, and they hired local defense counsel. And the witnesses were brought in before a Maltese judge. They were sworn in, which in that case is they had to swear to a cross. We fed the prosecutor questions. The defense attorneys fed the Maltese defense attorney questions, and the witnesses were questioned like they would be here in a trial in the United States. And we recorded it. The Maltese government recorded it for us. With regard to shipments in Syria, those actually went directly to Syria, and we gathered all the records for that, and we were able to show that they did it, and that they knew, and from information we gathered elsewhere, they knew that they weren't allowed to do so. One of the charges was false statements, because the documentation that they sent with the shipments was wrong. It identified the wrong end users. It said for the stuff going to Libya, that it would end up in Malta or would end up in Rome. That was a lie. They undervalued the value of the products. In other words, they would say it was worth a lot less than they were actually worth. That was a lie. So the charges for this part of the case were these IEPA violations, violating the specific executive orders designating Syria and Libya as state sponsors of terrorism, false statements for the false shipping documentation, and money laundering, because the payments that they're getting from outside the United States into the United States is a form of money laundering.
So were they tried and convicted in that conspiracy?
Yes. On August 21st, 2003, a jury found Infocom and the brothers guilty.
And for all that, the Elashi brothers, who operated and ran Infocom, were all found guilty after a 2-week trial. So the second half of the Infocom indictment involved payments to an individual named Musa Abu Marzouk and his wife Nadia Elashi. And it also stems from this IEPA, the Law of International Emergency Economic Powers Act, where President Clinton, back in '95, I believe it was, issued an executive order based on his powers through IEPA, where he designated certain organizations and individuals as specially designated terrorists. This was the very first terrorism designation the United States government had ever done. And some of the first designees was Hamas and Musa Abu Marzouk. Marzouk at the time was the leader of Hamas, and he also happened to be living in the United States. Well, Marzouk's wife, Nadia Elashi, was cousins to the guys who ran Infocom, the 5 Elashi brothers. And in 1991, Marzouk gave Infocom $150,000. In 1992, Marzouk and Infocom entered into what's called a Murabaha agreement, which is my understanding is it's an Islamic contract. And in that contract, they agreed that Marzouk, and it was actually under Nadia's name, would give $250,000 to Infocom, and in return, Infocom would send 40% of Infocom's profits back to Nadia Elashi. And soon after that agreement, another $100,000 was sent to Infocom. It really was all Marzouk's money. And thereafter, Infocom would send $3,000 a month to Nadia Elashi and her family up in Northern Virginia, where they were living at the time. When Marzouk was designated in, I believe it was August of 1995, he became persona non grata. It became illegal to have any financial dealings or any dealings with Marzouk, again, without a license from the U.S. government, which Infocom didn't get. After his designation, every payment that Infocom made to Marzouk, or to Nadia Elashi, but really Marzouk's money, was a crime. And so the second half of the Infocom indictment, we charged with this IEPA violation a whole bunch of the transactions. We charged one count of conspiracy to violate IEPA, where we had, I think, 3 of the Elashi brothers who were involved in sending the money, and we indicted Marzouk and Nadia, as well as Infocom as an entity. Our argument to the jury was Marzouk was going around the world doing Hamas's business, and this allowed him to do so knowing that his family is being taken care of by Infocom, and that's why they did this. In this case with Marzouk, we actually found the executive order designating Marzouk in Ghassan Elashi's office in Infocom. So the trials were severed between the first half of the Infocom case and the second half, and they took place, I can't remember how many months apart, maybe a year apart or less than that, 8 months apart. In the second case, it was 3 Elashi brothers. Marzouk and Nadia were not there at that point. Nadia had left the country. Marzouk was, we believe at that time, he was in Syria. He's not there now, is our understanding. And they were the three Elashi brothers and the entity were convicted after trial. They received between 60 months and 72 months, so between 5 years and 6 years in prison, depending upon the brother. Both cases were appealed by the Elashi brothers, and they were upheld.
So, Laura, were there other prosecutions during that time?
Yes, there were. You remember we spoke briefly about one of the speakers at that IEP convention was Samuel Arian, and we talked about how we would probably talk a little bit about him later. Well, Samuel Arian was a professor at a university in Florida, while at the same time he was supporting the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror organization. That's one of those terror organizations that had the same mission and goals as Hamas and often allies with them in even their suicide bombings and their attacks against civilians in Israel. So Samuel Arian, along with several other individuals, including a man named Hatem Faris, who I believe currently lives in Florida, were charged with providing support to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So he was a professor at the University of South Florida, and he was charged in the Middle District of Florida with a number of counts and ended up ultimately in, I believe it was 2006, he pled guilty to conspiring to provide services to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which was a terror organization. And he spent time in prison for that support of PIJ and then was ultimately deported from the United States. But we have continued to see the importance of his voice, and we're definitely going to talk about some collaboration that he will do in a couple of years after this episode with specifically the Muslim Legal Fund of America, the MLFA. So that'll be interesting when we take a look at that.
Look forward to hearing more about that topic. So, Laura, you were investigating Hamas in the U.S. at that point, right?
Yes, I was. And that investigation was quite complex and required a significant amount of travel.
Did you get to travel to Israel?
I did. Around April of 2003, a team of agents and prosecutors traveled abroad there to further study Hamas, the terrorist organization.
I bet you learned a lot.
Yes, we did. But I also learned how beautiful Tel Aviv is and how amazing Jerusalem is. I had never been there before. It's a bit overwhelming, but when I was there in Jerusalem, one could stand in a spot and hear the Muslim call to prayer, Jewish worshipers praying at the wall, and the bells from the Christian church of the Holy Sepulchre all at the same time.
Wow.
It was just a kind of a profound feeling to be surrounded by all of these religions in a peaceful context. Mm-hmm. We also socialized there in Tel Aviv at a little pub called Mike's Place. It's where a number of Westerners, especially people from the U.S., frequent. They go there to have a beer, listen to live music, enjoy good food. And when we went to Mike's Place, everyone there was nice, and it was such a happy place to be. And the server that waited on us was a young French lady who was utterly delightful, and her name was Dominique Caroline Haas.
It sounds like such a nice place to go and socialize.
Yes, it was, and it is even today. But about 2 weeks after our investigative team had beers there, Hamas dispatched 2 suicide bombers to Mike's Place, and Dominique was killed.
So the Mike's Place bombing was a watershed moment because this was arguably the first case in which two individuals who had really nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, these were British Muslims of South Asian background, radicalized in the UK. They were members or at least sympathizers of Al-Muhajirun, which was a local network out of the UK of radicals. So we're talking about second-generation radicalized Europeans traveled to Israel. They traveled to Jordan, then crossed into Israel and made their way to Tel Aviv and carried out the suicide bombing. What is interesting is that Hamas used them. It was Hamas that claimed the attack the day after. It was Hamas that provided the names of the 2 individuals. And while not all the details are clear of how deep the operational involvement of Hamas was, at least publicly, this is a very important moment in which Hamas really goes global because it managed to recruit and leverage people who were from a completely different continent and had no, let's say, blood ties to the conflict and to the region. So it's a globalization of Hamas and of the conflict that we had not seen prior to Mike's Place bombing.
I'm Judy Buckman-Zeev. I was born and raised in Suffolk, New York, Rockland County, Spring Valley area, better to say. I grew up there, and it was very in during the hippie era to go to Israel and visit and go to a kibbutz. And instead of going to California, many of us went to Israel to experience that. It was a very special thing to do, and I went over with a group, and I really liked Israel at the time. And I've always played music, and I've played guitar, I've sung, and I came back for school in New York for a year, and then I decided to go back to Israel. So I enrolled in Tel Aviv University. I got a degree in theater there, and eventually I got married there, and I had 2 children there, and I also got divorced there over time. And after my kids grew up, I decided to move back into Tel Aviv after living in a suburb of Tel Aviv for a while. And that brings us to that fateful night. I always enjoy different genres of music, but because I have a lower voice, I got into the blues, and my friends were very encouraging of me singing the blues, my musician friends. So on Tuesday nights, Mike's Place, this bar and restaurant along the Tel Aviv beach line, across from the beach, there was a blues jam every Tuesday night, and I started attending that in 2003, and I was a regular. I would go on Tuesday nights. I would know the musicians. You get up, you do a few songs, and then you switch, and it's a lot of fun. So the night we'll be talking about is April 30th. It was a regular Tuesday night. The regulars were there. I waited on the side of the stage, and a couple people went up. The gentleman who ran the jam was a music teacher and father of 2, and he would decide about the order. You come up, you go off, you come up. Usually got 2 or 3 songs. The musicians would rotate. There were guitar players, bass, drums, and keyboard, and the singers would rotate. And it was a very festive night. It was somebody's birthday. He sang a couple of songs. Another singer sang Son of a Preacher Man, which she did every week. And at some point, the leader said to the other musicians, okay, she'll do one more, and then we're going to switch. A new keyboard player came on, and he went outside, and the keyboard player went outside, and a few of us stayed inside. There was somebody filming. There was a flute player. So it was very festive. At about 1:15, I guess, there was all of a sudden a huge blast. If you lived in Israel at the time, you knew that this could happen because they were happening almost weekly. I mean, not far from Mike's Place, there was a dolphinarium. It was like a discotheque, and a whole bunch of young Russian teenagers were killed waiting online. It's like the sudden boom, and the door blew out, and you just scream and you stand there because what had just been a very festive restaurant full of burgers and fries and drinks is now a big bloody mess where there's blood on the tables, there's pieces of flesh, very gruesome. We didn't know what to do. We went to hide in the bathroom. And at that point, you really don't know what to do because they tell you in Israel there could be another bomb shortly that might go off. So finally, the owner of the bar just took control and just said, okay, everybody get out. Upon exiting the bar, I did slip on blood and people helped me up. I recall that. And I recall seeing a headless body in the middle of the floor and with some gruesome sights. I believe I saw insides on top of his green T-shirt. That I recall because I've always mentioned this fact that he seemed to be sort of fashionably dressed. I mean, he was wearing fashionable leather shoes and jeans, but the the corpse was headless. I remember seeing that, and I've been told that it was located somewhere else. But what always shocked me is that how this person who was dressed quite modern would, and obviously not destitute, would decide to come to blow up a bar of innocent people. And I actually had some flesh stuck to my pants, and I put them in the garbage. And later on, I realized you're not supposed to do that. So I went outside and I found ZACA, which is the Department of Medics who deal with human remains. And apparently, even a terrorist's remains are entitled to some sort of burial. So I brought the gentleman back in and he took it out of the garbage. The next day, I learned that the gentleman who led the jam every week, Yanai Weiss, who was actually a music teacher, was killed. I learned that the young man who played the keyboards while I was singing, it was his first time at Mike's place, was killed. And this lovely French waitress who just loved being in Israel and loved Mike's place and had made a lot of friends. She was a real main character at the bar, and she was killed. In my case, I not only went to the funeral of Yanai, who led the jam, I felt responsibility to go speak to his family because I was the last person to perform with him. So I went to his home and I met his wife and his children, and one of his sons asked me what was the last song he played, and I sang that for them. It was very difficult. And I had to visit the parents of a young man who was killed. And he was apparently a comedian and a very popular young guy who had his own little troupe, comedic troupe. And his little brother asked me if he was happy. What was he doing in his last song? Was he happy? Was he enjoying himself? And I felt a duty to tell him, yes, he was smiling and he was having a great time. How do these young men become so radicalized in Derby, England, with a middle-class life and families, that they found it to be a good deed to come to a strange country and blow up innocent people? And Mike's place also, the Arabs from Jaffa would come there. I mean, it was very welcoming to all. Well, Jack Baxter always we all strive for peace. He was a journalist in New York City, and he went over to Israel to find out if the gentleman who was in prison, Mr. Barghouti, was really possibly a good leader for the Palestinians and a possible partner for peace. And then when he got there, apparently there was just so much going on around Mr. Barghouti that Jack left that mission alone, and he went to hang out in Tel Aviv, and he stumbled across the blues bar with great music and nice people, welcoming vibe. And he decided while he was there to make a movie about Mike's place with a young filmmaker, Joshua, who was also the bartender. And they started just filming everyday events at Mike's place because Jack wanted to show a different part of Israel, not just war and strife. He wanted to show the peaceful coexistence and the people and the vibe of Tel Aviv. And ironically, while they were filming, he got caught up in it, and he was injured very seriously. He was in the hospital. And his film, Blues by the Beach, really depicts a lot real time of what happened that night.
There's just so much death at the hands of Hamas targeting civilians.
Yes, there's so much death.
How can they do this? How can they do this?
April 30th, 2003, just after midnight. seconds after an explosion.
I was laying in a puddle of beer and blood and broken glass. This is the closest I've ever come to death.
When the blast goes off, filmmaker Jack Baxter is finishing up a shoot on his documentary called Blues by the Beach, about this unique bar in Tel Aviv.
We started doing the documentary about Mike's place, and the waitresses, the bartenders, to try to get that perspective, pretty much stay out of the politics.
I want y'all to take care of all the people here in the house, the waitresses, the bartenders. This is a song about freedom.
Mike's Place is a bar where people come to escape the tension of a country too often torn apart by terrorism. The bar has an international feel. Nearly everyone speaks English, and talking about politics and religion is discouraged.
A good bartender knows how to get out of it eloquently. Good line is always, so are we still talking about sex?
Jack has chosen Mike's Place as the subject of his documentary to show how Israelis are coping with the violence.
Here you go, look. One eye, second eye.
Over the course of just 2 weeks, Jack has become close friends with the owner, Gal, bartenders Josh and Pavla, Avi, who works security, and Dominique, a 24-year-old waitress from France who has dreams of opening her own pastry shop.
She really affected me, and I guess the film shows what she's like.
It's Jack's last night in Israel. He's having a beer at a table outside, saying his goodbyes.
Dominique was sitting next to me. That's when one of the suicide bombers came up and tried to get into the place.
Avi, the security guard, has a bad feeling when 21-year-old Asif Hanif walks up.
The guy was a little bit too quick in his pace. Suicide bombings were going on all the time at that particular time. So we both looked at each other and froze.
Hanif is strapped with plastic explosives when Avi kicks him in the chest to keep him from entering the crowded bar.
And the next thing I can barely remember is this guy, stepping back up onto the sidewalk and yelling, Allahu Akbar.
As Hanif stumbles backwards, he blows himself up.
Thank you to all our viewers again for watching this episode on Mike's Place. Join us again for our next episode, The Archives.
Hey, 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 ya, ya,